The sun hung low over the tarmac, casting long shadows across the polished fuselage of Skyline Aviation's executive jet. Patricia Johnson stepped lightly from her car, the soft leather of her shoes barely making a sound on the concrete. She wore a muted gray blazer over a simple blouse, her silver hair tucked neatly under a small hat, and a worn leather bag swung from her shoulder. No designer luggage, no flashy jewelry, nothing to draw attention. To anyone watching, she looked like just another passenger trying to board a private flight, but beneath the calm exterior, every step carried decades of experience, struggle, and unspoken authority. As she approached the boarding stairs, a young man in a sharply pressed uniform intercepted her. James Wilson, flight attendant and gate enforcer, folded his arms across his chest, creating a rigid barrier in the aisle. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," he said, his voice polite but firm. "First class is for VIP passengers only. Your ticket must be for economy." He didn't even glance at her face, only at her attire, the worn bag, the subtle signs of simplicity he mistook for a lack of importance. Patricia's eyes met his, steady and calm. There was no hesitation in her voice as she extended the ticket. "Seat 1A, she said softly, deliberately, allowing the words to hang in the air. "I believe there's been a mistake." Wilson barely skimmed the paper before shaking his head, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Our systems sometimes fail. I'll have our ground staff sort this out." Patricia didn't flinch. She had faced condescension all her life, from skeptical bankers who doubted her loans in her 20s to clients who requested to speak to the real person in charge. Every slight, every whispered insult, every look that tried to undermine her authority had been a lesson in patience, in silent strength, in knowing when to act. She inhaled slowly, letting the sound of the jets taxiing and engines humming fill the brief silence. Around her, passengers shifted subtly in their seats. Some glanced at the scene with curiosity. Others looked away, uncomfortable, as if sensing tension they could not name. None of them knew who she really was. None could imagine that this unassuming figure had built the very empire these same planes represented. For a moment, a spark of indignation flared inside her, small but undeniable. Not the kind that shouts and rages, but the kind that stews quietly, grows steadily, and demands careful, precise action. She remembered long nights in drafty offices, negotiating contracts with skeptical white men who laughed at the idea of a young black woman controlling millions. She recalled the stares, the doubts, the countless times her competence was questioned simply because of who she was. Every memory strengthened her resolve, shaping a calm fury that was controlled, refined, and unstoppable. Patricia shifted her weight slightly, her gaze sweeping over the terminal, observing the subtle reactions of employees who were meant to be loyal, of passengers who sensed something unusual but couldn't place it. She allowed herself a tiny, knowing smile, almost imperceptible. She did not need to raise her voice. Her presence alone, the quiet authority that had carried her through decades of prejudice and doubt, began to change the energy around her. James Wilson hesitated, sensing something he could not define. There was a weight in her eyes, a confidence that made him step back slightly without even realizing it. Patricia didn't speak again immediately. She simply stood there, unassuming but unmovable, letting the silence do the work. Around her, the terminal seemed to hold its breath. Every minute stretched, charged with the unspoken question, who is this woman really, and why? Does it feel like everyone else is playing by the wrong rules? That first moment of indignation, born from years of silent struggle and relentless determination, had taken root. Patricia knew the rules of the game, the biases she would face, and the mistakes her staff might make. And she also knew, with the certainty of someone who had built an empire with her own hands, that underestimating her today would be the gravest mistake anyone could make. The stage was set, the tension crackled in the air, and Patricia Johnson, calm, composed, and quietly indignant, was ready to turn the impossible into her first act of undeniable authority. The air inside the jet terminal smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel, an aroma Patricia had come to associate with both long flights and high-stakes deals. She remained seated on the plastic chair James Wilson had grudgingly offered, her posture impeccably straight, radiating a calm that seemed to contradict the simmering tension around her. From inside the aircraft, a few passengers glanced toward her, whispering behind gloved hands, their curiosity barely masked by polite coughs. Patricia allowed herself a tiny, almost imperceptible smile. Every detail mattered: the timing, the observation, the way fear or uncertainty crept into others when they underestimated someone they thought powerless. Victoria Kane had been watching from the upper cabin, her eyes sharp, calculating, and cold. At 35, she was everything Skyline Aviation's board believed modern leadership should look like: sleek, ambitious, well-connected, and ruthlessly efficient. But ambition had a shadow, and hers was self-interest dressed in the language of progress. She had spent the last 6 weeks quietly reshaping the narrative within the company, planting seeds of doubt about the old guard, subtly eroding confidence in Patricia's leadership. Each postponed meeting, each whispered suggestion, each minor disruption in operatio had been calculated, and it had worked, up until now. James Wilson, still stationed like a human barricade, seemed to wobble between loyalty to procedure and instinctive unease. Patricia's gaze, calm and unblinking, tracked every movement within the aircraft and terminal. She noticed the subtle tension in his jaw, the slight hesitation in the tilt of his head. The first hint of panic had begun to show, though he wouldn't yet admit it, even to himself. Victoria leaned slightly toward Wilson, her voice low but sharp. "This woman can be problematic," she murmured, her tone dripping with feigned concern. "She asks too many questions things she shouldn't. She likes to stir trouble." Her words were a carefully measured poison, designed to inflame Wilson's sense of duty, to make him feel that denying Patricia boarding was not just acceptable but necessary. Wilson nodded, his confidence reinforced but tinged with the tiniest flicker of doubt. He did not yet realize that he was becoming a pawn in a game far larger than he understood. Victoria's smile, practiced and icy, belied the storm she had initiated, an orchestration of humiliation meant to elevate her own position while simultaneously eroding the reputation of a woman who had built everything from scratch. Patricia watched all of it with the patience of decades honed into poise. She understood the patterns of ambition, the subtle ways fear and self-interest could manipulate the inexperienced. She recognized every whisper of doubt in Wilson's demeanor and every calculated glance Victoria threw from within the cabin. And she remembered every moment in her life where she had been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, not for lack of talent, but because of prejudice. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she saw Roberto Mendez approaching quietly, his steps careful but resolute. The chief mechanic had been with Skyline Aviation for 15 years, witnessing both its triumphs and near collapse during turbulent corporate decisions. He carried no airs, no hidden ambitions, only loyalty tempered with intelligence. Patricia's eyes softened just slightly. Here was someone who understood the value of discretion, of knowledge, of silent support. As Roberto neared, he whispered almost as if sharing a secret, "You want me to check something for you?" Patricia's eyes met his, unblinking, her lips curving into the smallest of smiles. "Yes," she replied, her voice soft but deliberate. "Let's see who's been trying to rewrite reality." Around them, the terminal continued its quiet buzz, passengers unaware of the storm unfolding just a few steps away. Every subtle movement of staff, every whispered conversation, every hesitation on the part of Wilson and the other employees built a tension that could almost be felt physically. Patricia didn't rush, didn't raise her voice, didn't make a scene. She simply allowed the world to reveal itself, one revealing action at a time. And in that careful observation, the first threads of the conspiracy began to unravel, though Victoria and Wilson had no idea their carefully constructed illusion of control was beginning to collapse. Patricia's calm presence was more than a shield. It was a weapon, precise, patient, and unstoppable. The first move in a game that would expose ambition, greed, and prejudice had begun, and the players didn't even know the true force they were up against. Patricia sat in the plastic chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes gliding across the terminal with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people, situations, and possibilities. Around her, the murmur of passengers blended with the low hum of jet engines, but she heard it all, every whispered comment, every speculative glance. To anyone else, she might have seemed small, fragile Eve. But to Patricia, the space around her was alive with information. Every twitch of a uniform, every discreet smirk from someone trying to appear important was a clue. James Wilson had begun to sweat. He shifted his weight from one polished shoe to the other, glancing nervously at the cabin where Victoria Kane watched with a predator's patience. Each second of delay made him feel the weight of the responsibility Victoria had pressed onto his shoulders, yet something deep in him recoiled at the quiet authority radiating from the woman before him. Patricia noticed it, the hesitation, the barely perceptible doubt, and she allowed a tiny, almost imperceptible smile to curve her lips. Victoria, seated with an icy elegance inside the jet, whispered again to Wilson, emphasizing urgency and the importance of procedure. "This is what happens when the old guard tries to interfere," she said, her words clipped but deliberate. "Make sure she doesn't board, do you understand?" Wilson nodded, trying to appear resolute, but Patricia's gaze had already begun to penetrate the carefully constructed veil of compliance. From her peripheral vision, she saw Roberto Mendez approaching again, carrying a tablet. He had moved like a shadow, unnoticed by Victoria, unnoticed by Wilson, but Patricia knew exactly where he had been and what he had been observing. "Everything seems in order," he murmured quietly as he stopped beside her. "But we need to check the system. There are irregularities in the last month of operations, transfers, authorizations. Nothing matches the standard protocol." Patricia's pulse remained steady, her voice calm but deliberate. "Show me." Roberto handed her the tablet, and her eyes flicked across the screen with quiet efficiency, noting every anomaly, every misappropriated transfer, every pattern of deception that had been masked under the guise of modernization. The figure was a story of betrayal, of ambition overriding loyalty, and of someone attempting to seize power at the expense of the company she had built. The first whisper of panic stirred in Wilson's chest as he noticed Patricia leaning slightly over the tablet, her eyes sharp and precise. He had been trained to detect irregular behavior, but he had never faced someone like this, not merely an executive, but the architect of the empire itself, calm, unflappable, and devastatingly perceptive. Victoria's voice, now tinged with impatience, cut through the low hum of the terminal. "James, why isn't this resolved yet? You know who she is not. Just make sure the protocol is followed." Patricia looked up, her gaze cutting directly toward the aircraft cabin. Her voice, soft but unwavering, carried a weight that made the terminal fall into an almost imperceptible hush. "Protocol? Are you sure that's what this is about? Or is it about fear? About underestimating someone because they don't look like what you expect a CEO to look like?" The words hit Wilson like a cold wind. Every inch of him began to realize that the situation was no longer a simple matter of procedure. The uncertainty in his own actions began to creep in, shadowing the authority Victoria had demanded he enforce. Roberto leaned closer, his voice a quiet murmur meant only for Patricia. "All the unauthorized transfers originated from Victoria's terminal. 3 accounts, $2.3 million embezzled over 6 weeks. She's been manipulating the system, the meetings, the decisions. She's orchestrating this humiliation to cover her tracks." Patricia's lips pressed together briefly. The spark of indignation that had begun in Chapter 1 had grown into a simmering flame. Every whispered insult, every slight, every attempted sabotage had been accounted for, and now the pieces were in her hands. She rose slowly from the plastic chair, every movement deliberate, every step a silent signal of authority. Her gaze swept over the terminal, capturing passengers, employees, and the gate crew alike. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the subtle power of experience and intelligence radiating from her like a physical force. The first act of exposure was ready to begin, and the terminal, full of people who thought they controlled the narrative, had no idea that their carefully constructed illusions were about to collapse. Patricia Johnson, calm, composed, and quietly indignant, was about to turn a moment of orchestrated humiliation into a revelation no one would forget. Patricia stepped closer to the terminal window, her eyes scanning the tarmac where her fleet of Skyline aviation jets gleamed under the morning sun. Each plane was a monument to decades of tireless work, sacrifices made when the world had doubted her, loans denied, and doors closed simply because of her age, her race, or her gender. Now, they stood silent witnesses to the audacity of those who thought they could undermine her with a staged display of authority. James Wilson shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in energy. Patricia's calm had transformed into something heavier, something unmistakable, command. The very air seemed to bend around her, drawing attention without her needing to speak. Passengers, previously curious but detached, began to notice, whispering among themselves, sensing that a story far larger than a routine flight was unfolding. Victoria Kane, from her seat inside the aircraft, leaned forward, her expression tight with impatience. She had orchestrated this moment with precision, or so she thought. Each delayed meeting, each minor operational disruption, had been calculated to undermine Patricia's authority and create the perfect facade of incompetence. But she had underestimated the depth of the woman she sought to humiliate. Patricia's reputation wasn't built on titles or appearances. It was built on results, on knowledge that ran deeper than anyone within that cabin could comprehend. Roberto Mendez approached silently, his tablet now displaying a detailed record of every unauthorized transaction, every manipulation of company systems, every fraudulent instruction sent under Victoria's name. "All of this," he murmured to Patricia, "originates from her terminal. She's tried to rewrite reality." Patricia nodded, a subtle, deliberate movement. "Then it's time to show them exactly whose reality it is." Her voice was calm, yet carried a weight that made even Wilson step back instinctively. There was no shouting, no grand gesture, only the quiet, inevitable authority of someone who had survived and thrived despite a lifetime of obstacles. She took a step forward, positioning herself where every eye in the terminal could see her, every passenger now part of the unfolding narrative. "James," she said, her tone measured, deliberate, "do you realize how many jobs are protected by these planes, by this company? How many families rely on what we do here every single day?" Wilson swallowed hard. He had been prepared to act as enforcer, to stand in her way without question, but the calm certainty in her voice, the intimate knowledge of every operational detail, pierced through his assumptions. Doubt crept in where certainty had lived just moments before. Victoria's whispered commands from inside the aircraft lost their bite as Patricia continued. "The actions of those inside this cabin are not only reckless, they are criminal, and every decision made under the guise of modernizing operations is now documented, recorded, and ready to be presented to those who hold true authority." The terminal fell into a tense silence. Passengers exchanged glances, staff hesitated mid-step, and even Wilson found his mouth dry, unsure of how to respond. Patricia didn't need to raise her voice. The magnitude of her words, backed by evidence and decades of experience, spoke for themselves. Roberto discreetly activated the internal terminal system, ensuring that every word, every piece of evidence, was now audible and visible to those inside the aircraft. Victoria's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble in real time. Whispers of disbelief spread across the cabin. The elite passengers who had once ignored Patricia's presence now watched, stunned, as the authority they had assumed rested in the hands of someone else was revealed for what it truly was. Patricia's gaze met Victoria's, steady and unflinching. "Did you really believe that someone who built everything from nothing wouldn't recognize an attempted betrayal when it was unfolding in front of her? That the woman who turned a single inherited plane into a billion-dollar enterprise wouldn't see the truth?" Victoria's face paled, her confident mask cracking. She tried to speak, but no words came. Around them, the terminal seemed to hold its breath, aware that a reckoning was taking place, not just for Victoria, but for every person who had underestimated Patricia, who had thought her calm demeanor a sign of weakness rather than the steel it concealed. Patricia's voice dropped slightly, but the weight of it was undeniable. "This isn't just about a seat on a plane. This is about integrity, loyalty, and respect, and every single act of deceit and betrayal is about to be accounted for." The first shockwave had begun. The humiliation she had endured for minutes or hours, it felt like, was about to flip, transforming into a public revelation that no one in the terminal, and certainly not Victoria, would ever forget. Patricia stepped closer to the aircraft entrance, the polished floor reflecting her calm, unwavering presence. Every detail of her surroundings, the hum of the terminal, the murmurs of passengers, the stiff posture of staff, was registered with the precision of someone who had spent decades mastering both people and situations. She didn't rush. There was no need. Authority didn't require haste. It required timing, knowledge, and confidence. And she had all three in abundance. James Wilson's hands fidgeted at his sides, his earlier confidence now unraveling. He had believed he was merely following orders, acting as a gatekeeper for protocol. But the more he observed Patricia, the more he realized that he had walked into something far larger than any procedural rulebook. Every pause, every deliberate step of hers conveyed a silent message. She was not intimidated, she was not confused, and she certainly wasn't someone to be underestimated. Victoria Kane's expression inside the jet flickered between disbelief and panic. Her carefully constructed plan, designed to humiliate a woman she thought old and out of touch, was collapsing. She opened her mouth, likely to protest, but Patricia didn't give her the courtesy of interruption. Instead, she calmly raised her hand and allowed a moment of silence to settle over the terminal. It was a silence pregnant with anticipation, charged with authority, and every person present, employees, passengers, even Wilson, felt its weight. Patricia turned slightly to Roberto Mendez, her trusted confidant, who stood quietly by her side. A subtle nod passed between them. In one smooth motion, Roberto tapped his tablet, and the terminal's internal announcement system came alive. Every seat, every officer, every passenger could hear the clear, undeniable evidence. Victoria Kane's voice, instructing falsifications, manipulating internal transfers. Chase and orchestrating a systematic campaign of sabotage against the very company she claimed to serve. Gasps rippled across the terminal. Passengers leaned forward, some wide-eyed, others covering their mouths in shock. Wilson's knees weakened. He looked to Victoria for guidance, but her usual icy composure had melted into visible terror. The young executive had miscalculated the intelligence, experience, and sheer resilience of the woman standing before her. Patricia's voice cut through the stunned quiet, calm but sharp, deliberate in every word. Do you realize, Ms. Kane, what it means to underestimate someone because of appearance, because of age, because of color? Her gaze swept over the cabin, landing on employees who had acted complicitly, and she continued. Every action you took, every protocol you twisted, was done under false assumptions. Assumptions that I would not see. Assumptions that I would not act. Victoria tried to interject, her voice trembling. I was only trying to modernize the company. Patricia's smile was slight but merciless in its clarity. Modernize? By stealing, lying, and humiliating those who built this company? Is that your version of progress? She stepped closer, her presence filling the aisle, commanding the attention of everyone present. You thought a 72-year-old woman, a black woman who started from nothing, wouldn't recognize your deception. That's the gravest miscalculation of your life. The evidence continued to play, crystal clear. Every word Victoria had spoken exposed in stark contrast to Patricia's composed authority. Wilson stumbled back, realizing that his role in the attempted humiliation could no longer be defended. He had been a pawn, manipulated by Victoria's ambition, and now the truth of his participation was undeniable. Patricia paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Integrity cannot be fabricas. Ted, authority is earned, not stolen, and those who seek to undermine it are always found out. By the time security arrived, Victoria was no longer an intimidating figure, but a figure of despair, her plan dismantled in front of everyone. Wilson, ashamed but relieved to be spared the worst of Patricia's judgment, stepped aside quietly. The passengers and employees watched in awe, witnessing not just a confrontation, but a masterclass in poise, justice, and intellect. Patricia finally allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She had turned a moment of orchestrated humiliation into a demonstration of true power, built on decades of experience, unshakable integrity, and a calm understanding of human nature. The first act of reckoning was complete, and the terminal, once a stage for prejudice, had become a testament to resilience, intelligence, and dignity. Patricia stood at the threshold of the aircraft, the morning sunlight casting long shadows across the tarmac, illuminating her calm but indomitable figure. Every passenger, every employee, every onlooker felt the shift in the air, the quiet, unstoppable force of a woman whose authority and experience could not be denied. She had weathered decades of prejudice, whispered doubts, and outright sabotage, and now, those who had underestimated her were realizing the weight of their miscalculations. Roberto Mendez stepped closer, his tablet now fully displaying Victoria Kane's manipulations, fraudulent transfers, falsified reports, and unauthorized commands. It's all here, he said quietly. Every irregularity, every violation, traced directly to her terminal. Patricia nodded, her mind already mapping the next steps. She did not need to shout. The evidence spoke for itself. What had been a moment of personal humiliation was now transformed into a demonstration of unassailable authority. Patricia turned her gaze toward James Wilson, the young flight attendant who had blocked her path. His earlier smugness had dissolved into a mixture of fear and regret. James, she said, her voice soft but firm, you were misled. You acted in good faith, believing you were protecting the standards of this company, but every standard is meaningless without integrity. Remember that. Your mistake isn't unforgivable, but it is instructive. Wilson swallowed hard, tears glimmering in his eyes. He nodded mutely, feeling the weight of her words. In one quiet gesture, Patricia had taught him a lesson that no reprimand could have delivered. Then she turned her attention fully to Victoria. The young executive had slumped in her seat, the carefully maintained veneer of confidence shattered. Her face, pale and streaked with the remnants of mascara, was a portrait of desperation. Patricia's voice was deliberate, carrying every ounce of authority she had accumulated over a lifetime. Victoria, your ambition was blind and your arrogance has consequences. The embezzlement, the sabotage, the attempts to humiliate me, they are all recorded. Every transaction, every word, every action, documented. Victoria's lips trembled. I didn't think... Patricia's gaze pierced her. You didn't think because you assumed power comes from deception, not from building. You mistook aggression for authority and manipulation for leadership. You have just learned the hard way that true power cannot be stolen, it is earned, and anyone who seeks to undermine it will face consequences. Security officers quietly entered the terminal, guided by the confirmation Patricia had already sent to the board. Within moments, Victoria was escorted from the plane, her protests falling on deaf ears. Passengers and staff watched in stunned silence as the orchestrated humiliation had been reversed, leaving Patricia not just vindicated, but elevated in stature, not by force, but by integrity and intellect. Patricia finally allowed herself to exhale, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossing her face. She had turned an attempt to belittle her into a demonstration of what real leadership, resilience, and dignity looked like. Every employee present, every passenger who had witnessed the scene had seen the proof. That experience, wisdom, and integrity could command more authority than arrogance or pretense ever could. She turned to Roberto, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you. You've always known what needed to be done." Roberto smiled quietly. "It's because of you, Dona Patricia. You've built more than a company. You've built a legacy of integrity that can't be undermined by anyone." As she finally walked up the steps into her jet, the crew and passengers parted instinctively, recognizing the quiet power in her presence. She took her seat, looking out at the tarmac where her fleet waited. Each plane represented a decade of tireless work, each contract a testament to her perseverance. The day had begun with humiliation, but it would end as a lesson in resilience, leadership, and justice. The terminal slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but Patricia's presence left a lasting imprint, a reminder that underestimating someone who had built everything from scratch was the gravest mistake anyone could make. She leaned back, her hands folded calmly in her lap, and thought, "This is how battles are won, not by anger, but by proving the truth in every action." The hum of the engines was a distant, almost comforting murmur as Patricia settled into her familiar seat, the same one she had chosen decades ago for countless flights that had shaped her empire. The terminal, now emptying of passengers and staff, had become a silent witness to the reversal of a carefully plotted humiliation. Outside, the tarmac gleamed under the late afternoon sun, each of her aircraft a monument to years of relentless determination, sleepless nights, and battles fought in boardrooms, banks, and beyond. Victoria Kane's downfall had been swift and decisive. Within hours, the board had convened, reviewing every transaction, every email, and every falsified report. The weight of indisputable evidence left them no choice. She was immediately suspended pending full investigation, and within days, her embezzlement and conspiracy charges were formally filed. The news rippled through the company, sending a clear message. Skyline Aviation operated not just on contracts and aircraft, but on integrity, accountability, and respect. Meanwhile, James Wilson, the young flight attendant who had once blocked her path, approached her quietly as the cabin doors closed. There was a humility in his step that hadn't been there before, a recognition of how narrowly he had come to becoming complicit in the destruction of everything she had built. "Dona Patricia," he said softly, "thank you. I've never seen anyone command respect without raising their voice. I hope to carry that lesson with me, always." Patricia's eyes softened and she nodded. "Respect and authority are not earned through fear or position, James. They are earned through action, integrity, and how you treat people when no one is watching." Roberto Mendez took his place beside her, a steady presence as always. He had been instrumental in exposing Victoria, but more importantly, he had been a loyal confidant for years. "The board wants to implement your recommendations," he said. "Full transparency, universal dignity protocols, anti-discrimination training. They want Skyline Aviation to be a model, not just a company." Patricia allowed a small, satisfied smile to play at her lips. She had never built her empire to be admired. She had built it to be just, efficient, and unassailable. Passengers who had watched the morning's confrontation had shared their astonishment on social media. The story of the elderly black KCEO denied boarding her own plane, only to reveal her identity and expose corruption, went viral, but not as a tale of vengeance. It became a lesson in dignity, resilience, and justice. Comments poured in, people inspired to confront prejudice, to lead with integrity, to recognize the strength in those who had been underestimated. Victoria Kane, stripped of her power, luxury, and reputation, faced a stark and unyielding reality. 8 years in prison, forfeited assets, and the collapse of her social standing marked the end of her ambitions. Every step of her arrogance had been documented, and every act of deceit had been overturned. She had attempted to modernize through manipulation, but the lesson she learned, the one she could not escape, was that true leadership could never be stolen. Patricia's flight lifted into the sky, serene and deliberate. She gazed at the horizon, reflecting on the morning that had begun with humiliation and ended with revelation. The incident had been more than a confrontation. It had been a reaffirmation of everything she believed, that integrity outweighs pretense. Experience outweighs ambition, untempered by wisdom. and resilience outweighs prejudice. In her private journal, she later wrote, "There is a difference between winning a battle and winning a war. Battles are won by proving you were right. Wars are won by changing the world so that future battles are unnecessary." Months later, Skyline Aviation thrived beyond expectations. Contracts soared, minority entrepreneurs sought the company's services for genuine respect, and company-wide reforms created a culture where appearance, age, or background no longer dictated how one was treated. James Wilson had rebuilt his career with humility and purpose. Roberto Mendez had been promoted to Director of Operations, recognized not just for skill but for loyalty and ethical clarity. As for Patricia, she remained the embodiment of quiet, unassailable power, a woman who had faced systemis, bias, attempted betrayal, and outright humiliation, only to transform every challenge into a testament of resilience, integrity, and unwavering dignity. Her empire had not only survived, it had grown stronger, setting a precedent for generations of leaders to come. The lesson was clear, and the world had seen it. True power does not come from taking from others. It comes from building, protecting, and inspiring, even in the face of the harshest injustice.